Hello, friends, and let's get started.
Ryan watched Jessica put the empty coffee cup in the sink. She didn't look at him. A deep crease ran between her brows, and he knew something was going wrong. But he'd gotten so used to those little signs of discontent over the past few years that he'd stopped noticing them. Work, bills, everyday life, it all ate up their time, leaving them alone only in the late evenings when they were both too tired to talk, let alone anything more. "You're home late today," she said without turning around. Her voice sounded flat, almost colorless. "Yes," he answered, taking a seat on a stool by the kitchen island. "Got held up in a meeting." She nodded, but didn't say another word. His own phrases lately had been similarly short and neutral. He'd thought it was just a normal phase of married life. Tiredness, routine. But in recent weeks, the feeling of something broken had gotten stronger. Jessica had become different, but Ryan didn't know how to put it all back together. Steve and Lauren called in the evening. They rarely visited, but every time they showed up, they brought a sense of celebration into the house. Ryan listened to them in the background while Jessica talked animatedly, laughing like she used to. He was nostalgic. There had been a time when he and Jessica had laughed like this, too, easily, genuinely. He wanted to believe that all was not lost. "So come with us." Steve finished with a clap of his hands. "You'll love it." "Where?" Ryan asked, snapping out of his thoughts. "It's just a party. A little get-together for adults. Let's say." Lauren leaned forward as if sharing a secret. "No pressure, of course. It's just fun." Jessica smiled and, to his surprise, looked at him not with her usual boredom, but with a slight challenge. "We could try it," she said. Ryan froze. He couldn't say the suggestion inspired him. The word party sounded innocent, but there was clearly something more lurking in the subtext. He glanced at Steve, at Lauren. Their faces lit up with excitement, almost like teenagers proposing a runaway party. Then he looked at Jessica. Her eyes were shining, her voice sounded soft, and her lips were trembling slightly, as if she were nervous. Not sure," he finally stretched out. It's not really our style. It's just going out, Ryan," Jessica said, tugging on his arm. "You were the one who said we should try something new. Let's just go and see. If we don't like it, we'll leave. No strings attached." He wanted to object, but something in her voice stopped him. She looked like this was really important to her. Like this was a chance to get back what they'd lost. Ryan looked at Steve, at Lauren, then back at Jessica. Her gaze was pleading, but there was something else slipping into it, something he couldn't make out. She rarely asked him for something like this, and maybe that was why he sighed and nodded. "Okay, one time, but if I don't like it, we're leaving." Jessica smiled, a real, lively smile, and he suddenly wondered how had she felt all those months while he'd thought everything in their lives was normal. The engine noise died down as Ryan turned off the engine. There was silence all around, only the soft rustling of the wind in the tall trees. A massive metal gate loomed in front of them, illuminated by a soft yellow light. Behind them was a long driveway, drowning in darkness, and the silhouette of a large house outlined by dim lights. "Is this here?" Ryan asked, raising an eyebrow. He didn't hide his skepticism as he surveyed the surroundings. "Yes," Jessica answered briefly, not taking her eyes off the gate. The headlights illuminated the granite pillar with the security camera. A second later, there was a soft click, and the gate slowly opened. Ryan hesitated for a moment before starting the engine again. The car started smoothly, rolling down the tile driveway, and soon they were in front of the house. The mansion seemed ripped from another era. The light from the windows poured in soft, warm streams. Inside, silhouettes of people glimmered behind the fishnet curtains, muffled laughter and the sounds of jazz. Ryan opened the car door and got out first. He looked back. Jessica stepped out of the car with a smile, adjusting her dress. Her face, slightly pink with excitement, seemed different to him. Her eyes shone especially bright in the dim light of the street lamp. "Are you sure you want to go?" he asked quietly. "Aren't you?" she answered, turning coquettishly toward him. "Let's just watch." Ryan felt something inside him tense. His tension transferred to his hands, and he clenched his fingers tighter. But it had no effect on her. She just adjusted the strap on her shoulder, exhaled, and headed for the entrance. The hallway greeted them with the smell of expensive wood and fresh flowers. Marble tiles glistened on the floor, and the scent of vanilla and tobacco wafted through the air. Ryan glanced at the ceiling, decorated with intricate moldings, then at the wall, where a painting hung in a massive gilded frame. Everything screamed luxury, and he felt uncomfortable. Jessica, on the other hand, was in her element. Her movements became more fluid, her gait confident. She said hello to someone, walked to the champagne table, and took a glass. While Ryan stood timidly at the entrance, Jessica was already engaged in a lively conversation. "Honey, would you introduce us to your friends?" Came a voice from behind. Lauren and Steve, their old acquaintances, appeared as if out of thin air. Lauren held out her hand, her rings gleaming in the chandelier light. "I'm glad you guys came." Ryan smiled, trying to look casual, but he was uncomfortable. Jessica, meanwhile, was laughing, cracking jokes with Lauren as if they'd known each other a long time. He stood nearby, a silent observer, and for a moment he felt like everyone around him wasn't looking at him. People moved gracefully through the room, as if on a stage. Champagne was flowing, conversations were half-hearted. Everything that was going on resembled a theatrical production, and only Jessica seemed to play one of the main roles in this play. "How do you like it here?" Lauren asked, smiling at Ryan. "Impressive," he said. She grinned, but before she could answer, two men approached them. One of them said hello to Jessica with obvious sympathy. She answered him so casually that Ryan tensed. "This is definitely your first time here, isn't it, Jess?" Lauren remarked curtly, as if by the way. Ryan turned to Jessica. Something flashed across her face that he couldn't make out, but for a second she looked uncomfortable. She smiled quickly, as if she wanted to smooth over the awkwardness. "I just get used to people quickly," she joked. But that smile wasn't the same. There was no warmth in it. Ryan felt his insides grow cold. Lauren, meanwhile, just smiled enigmatically. The music around them grew louder. The laughter of the guests filled the room. But for Ryan, it all disappeared for a moment. He looked at his wife and realized something was wrong. Jessica slid over to a group of people whose laughter was louder than the rest. Ryan watched her deftly blend into the conversation as if she'd known these people all her life. She laughed, tilting her head slightly, lightly touching the arm of the man who was speaking. Her movements had a confidence he hadn't seen in a long time. The party had turned into something Ryan couldn't understand. It wasn't just socializing or friendly conversation. It was something else. "Relax, buddy." Steve clapped him on the shoulder like he knew what he was thinking. "You're too tense. We're all here to have a little fun." Ryan looked at him. He wanted to say something, but his tongue felt like it was glued to his palate. He shifted his gaze back to Jessica. She was now engaged in an animated conversation with a couple. The man in the suit was saying something that made her laugh, and the woman, slender and flamboyant, was squeezing her hand as if confirming something important. "What's going on here?" Ryan finally asked. Steve grinned and took a sip of champagne. "Just a normal evening," he answered, as if it really didn't mean anything. But Ryan sensed something was wrong. The confidence with which Jessica spoke, her ease, her mannerisms, it all seemed out of place. In the past, she'd always kept a low profile, a low-key demeanor. And here it was as if she'd found a new version of herself. Or was it not a new version, but the real one? He didn't know which was worse. After a few minutes, Jessica walked over to him, placing her hand on his shoulder. Her face was glowing with excitement. "I'm going to go see what's next," she said. "Is that okay with you?" "What do you mean, what's next?" he asked, frowning. "Just another room. It's where people get to know each other, socialize." "It's informal," she smiled, but her gaze was quick, like she was looking for his approval. "I'll stay here," he replied. "You go if you want." Jessica lingered for a moment, then nodded and stepped away. Soon her figure disappeared behind the door. Ryan was left standing in the middle of the noisy hall, feeling an inner chill begin to rise from his stomach to his throat. Lauren approached, holding a cocktail glass. Her face was focused, but her lips curved in a slight smile. "Is something wrong?" she asked, noticing how tense he was. "She's in there, behind those doors." Ryan started, but fell silent, not knowing how to explain. "Why is she acting like that?" Lauren glanced at him, not hiding a mocking expression. Did you really think it was her first time? She said, raising an eyebrow. The words sounded so calm, so casual, that it took Ryan a few seconds to realize their meaning. What do you mean? His voice shook. Lauren shrugged. She's been her own here for a long time. Knows how things work. Knows the people. Haven't you noticed the way they say hello to her? Ryan froze as if he'd been punched in the chest. He remembered those greetings, those smiles, the looks they threw at Jessica. Everything that had seemed trivial to him suddenly came together into a coherent picture. Her confidence, the way she moved, her ease of conversation. It wasn't spontaneous. It was rehearsed. You're kidding, right? He tried to convince himself it was just a joke. Wasn't she? Lauren grinned and shook her head. Ryan, I'm not kidding. She knows this place, these people, knows what they do here, and knows how to handle it. He couldn't speak. His throat was tight. He wanted to leave, but his feet felt like they were stuck to the floor. He turned, looked toward the door where Jessica had disappeared. There, behind the closed door, she was no longer there. And he didn't know when exactly that had happened, when she'd started to belong not to him, but to this place. Ryan wandered around the hall as if half asleep. The feeling of unnaturalness of what was happening only grew stronger. He felt like everything around him was faking. The conversations sounded too sweet, the smiles too perfect. He wanted to leave, but he couldn't. Jessica was still out there somewhere, in one of those rooms that seemed frighteningly alien to him. The music changed to a quieter, velvety beat. People chatted in muffled voices, occasionally throwing Ryan brief glances. He tried not to catch them. This whole evening was like a bad dream. A couple walked past him, a woman in a sparkling dress, her companion in a perfectly fitting suit. They stopped nearby and started talking. Ryan wouldn't have paid attention if he hadn't heard a familiar name. Jessica? Yes, she's gorgeous, the man said, leaning slightly toward the woman. I remember her from last spring. She made quite a splash then. No one expected her to. He stopped talking when he saw Ryan. He pretended not to listen, though his heart was pounding in his throat now. The woman laughed, but her laughter quickly died down when she caught Ryan's gaze. Is everything okay? The man asked. Ryan wanted to say something, but changed his mind. He turned around and walked away. However, their words still echoed in his ears. Since last spring, made a sensation. What did that even mean? How long had it been going on? And how could he not have noticed anything? He was walking past the bar when he heard another phrase. Two men were discussing someone who clearly stood out from the crowd. She was always brave, one of them said. Remember that night on the roof? How can you forget her? Laughed the other. Jessica knows how to create an atmosphere. Her energy, you can't miss it. Ryan stopped. He could barely hear anything over the music, but the name came through clearly again. His wife. They were talking about his wife. His feet carried him forward. He no longer noticed where he was going. He went up the stairs, turned toward the private rooms. The guard at the door didn't stop him. Maybe he thought he was one of his own. Ryan walked past, barely noticing the people around him. He was looking for Jessica. The sound of voices grew louder. One of them was hers. She was laughing. It was the kind of laugh he used to hear at home when they first started dating. Carefree light. But now it sounded here, in this place, and Ryan no longer felt joy. Ryan pushed open the door, not even thinking about what he'd find behind it. Everything inside him was boiling. Anger, fear, some painful premonition that made his stomach clench. He knew he should stop, that he might see something he could never forget, but his body was already moving on its own. The door swung open. Jessica. She wasn't alone. A room with soft, diffused light. The air filled with the scents of leather, alcohol, perfume. It all seemed too sensual. Music blared muffled from the speakers, but Ryan barely heard it. Another picture caught his attention. Jessica. She was at the center of the whole mess. Horny, excited, disheveled. Her lips open, her eyes glistening. Beside her were three men. One stood in front of her, his hand tangled in her hair, his fingers lightly touching her face. Jessica looked up, her lips moving, accepting him. She did it slowly, with pleasure, as if it wasn't the first time. And the other two were behind her. Their hands moved over her body, stroking, exploring, squeezing her thighs, holding her waist. They were pulling her toward them, bringing her closer, filling the space around her. She gasped, but not from fear, from pleasure. She moaned. She gave herself completely to them. Their movements quickened. The sounds intensified. Ryan watched. He could feel his heart racing, something heavy coming up to his throat. He wanted to turn away, wanted to close his eyes, but he couldn't. He was in shock. And then she opened her eyes and looked at him. Their gazes met. Her eyes flashed first with confusion, then slight shock. Her body tensed, but she didn't jump up, didn't recoil, didn't make a single movement that suggested remorse or fear. She just stared at him. Her face showed something akin to regret at first, but it was quickly replaced by irritation, as if he was an extra here, like he was the one who had disrupted her evening. Ryan, her voice was hoarse but not guilty. He didn't answer. He couldn't, because the world around him was cracking at the seams, crumbling, breaking under the weight of what he'd seen. And now he didn't know what to do. Ryan stood there as if paralyzed. Everything he'd ever known about his wife was snapping at the seams, crumbling to dust. The image was still in his mind's eye. Her disheveled hair, her open lips, her hands clutching at other people's bodies. "Ryan," Jessica said again, a tinge of irritation in her voice. As if he were the problem. As if his presence here was a hindrance to her. Something inside him exploded. He needed to break free. Immediately. He turned and stormed out of the room, slamming the door behind him so sharply that the painting on the wall tilted slightly. His feet carried him down the corridor, down the stairs, through the warm, odor-filled hall. He couldn't see people's faces, couldn't hear them talking, just the sound of blood in his ears. "Hey, Ryan, where are you going?" Came Steve's voice, but he didn't even turn around. He took a step out the door, took a gulp of cool night air. His hands were shaking, his heart was racing. The car stood where he'd left it. He jerked open the door, got behind the wheel, slapped his palms on the steering wheel. Shit, 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 shit. He started the engine. The wheels shrieked as he sped away, leaving the mansion behind. He didn't care where he was going. The important thing was to get away from here. Home, just as long as he could get home. Ryan sat in the dark, slumped on the edge of the bed. He clutched a glass of whiskey in his hands, but even the alcohol didn't help. His head was buzzing, his thoughts were jumbled, and the scene was still in front of his eyes. 2 hours. 2 hours he spent in absolute silence. Didn't turn on the lights, didn't turn on the TV. He just sat there, feeling everything inside him, but he couldn't get it out. He thought that anger would come at once, that he would scream, smash something, throw furniture. But instead, numbness came instead. It was as if his mind refused to comprehend what had happened. And then suddenly a sound, quiet but clear, the click of the lock. Ryan didn't move, only gripped the glass tighter. Footsteps came from the hallway. They were cautious, slow, as if she hoped he was asleep, that she could just walk past him and avoid the conversation. But he wasn't asleep. Jessica appeared in the bedroom doorway, her figure silhouetted against the light from the hallway. She froze when she saw him sitting up in the darkness. "Ryan," her voice was quiet, but carried no fear or remorse. More like fatigue. He lifted his head, met her gaze. Something heavy, thick, almost suffocating stirred inside. She stood a few paces away, but seemed farther away than ever. "Have you decided to come back?" He spoke at last. His voice was hoarse, as if he were a stranger. Jessica exhaled and stepped into the room. "We need to talk." Ryan grinned, bitterly, sharp, but he didn't answer. Jessica stood at the door, barely setting foot on the threshold of the bedroom. Her silhouette was outlined by the soft light from the hallway, but even that dim halo didn't hide the tension in her posture. Ryan stared at her, but there was no surprise or anger in his gaze. Just emptiness. "We need to talk," she said again, her voice calm, but with a barely perceptible hoarseness. He rose slowly from the bed, leaving the glass of whiskey on the bedside table. He went to the window, rested his hands on the sill, and remained silent for a long time. "About what?" he said at last, without turning to her. "About us," she answered. Her words hung in the air, unanswered. "About us," he repeated, muffled. "Are you sure we still have an us?" She remained silent. He heard her footsteps, soft, careful. She came into the room, but kept her distance. I'm tired of hiding, Ryan, she said flatly. He turned around slowly. His eyes met hers, and for a second he thought he was looking at a different Jessica than the one he'd known for 10 years. There was a different woman in front of him. Confident. Alien. Hiding? He asked with a grin that wasn't even remotely funny. You're tired of hiding. From who? From me? She slumped her shoulders, as if shedding the last of her weight. Yes, she answered simply. Ryan stepped closer. Now they were standing almost right next to each other. So all this time you've been leading a double life, and he hesitated, but then clenched his jaw and continued. And I was just what? A cozy cover? A husband to pity? Jessica didn't look away. I tried to save our marriage. Thought I could, that it was just a phase, that it would pass. He felt anger boiling up inside him. It'll pass. His voice broke. You cheated on me. Not once, not twice, not by accident. It's not a mistake. It's your damn choice. She bit her lip, but said nothing. You're not even sorry. His voice wasn't so loud anymore, but there was something dangerous ringing in it. You just stand there and calmly tell me you're tired of pretending? What do you want, Ryan? Her voice had hardened, too. A scene of remorse? A plea for forgiveness? For me to cry and repent? No. He turned sharply toward her, and she backed away slightly. I want you to be honest. To me. To yourself. She took a deep breath, as if gathering her strength. Good, she said at last. I have no regrets. The words hit harder than any scream. Ryan clenched his fists. Then why are you here? She looked at him, studying his face as if trying to find the answer inside him. Because you deserve to hear the truth. Her voice was steady, but a subtle shiver slipped into it. He nodded. Then here's my truth, he said, inhaling deeply. I don't want to live with a woman who... He fell silent, but the meaning was clear. She nodded. I understand. There was silence in the room. Ryan suddenly felt like he couldn't be here anymore. This house, this bedroom, everything seemed repulsively foreign to him. He turned around, grabbed his keys off the dresser, and headed for the door. As he passed her, he stopped for a split second. Goodbye, Jessica. And then he was gone. The door slammed loudly, leaving her in the dark. Ryan didn't look back. Not when he stepped outside the house. Not when he got into the car. Not when he started the engine and pulled sharply out of the driveway. He just drove away. The city was behind him. Jessica, their home, their shared memories all burned into his mind, turning into ashes that weren't worth scattering. He drove without looking at the signs, not knowing where the road led, but with each kilometer it became easier inside. He no longer asked himself, how did I not notice? Why didn't I stop? What did it all go wrong? It didn't matter anymore. A few days later, he found himself in a new place. A small town, unremarkable but quiet. He rented an apartment on the outskirts, got a job that didn't require too much talking. He stayed in the shadows, didn't look for acquaintances, didn't tell anyone where he came from or why he came alone. And then the rumors started to come. First by accident, some old friend wrote in social networks. Then came a message from a former colleague. Have you heard? Jessica now frequents that club. They say she's already being recognized at the door there. Ryan looked at the screen, read it again, but felt nothing. He knew this was going to happen. She'd made her choice. He'd made his. He closed the phone, stepped out onto the porch, breathed in the fresh air. The desolate evening landscape spread out before him. No shadows of the past, no deceit, no pain. Just him and freedom.